was every parent's nightmare. A sudden silence where there had been just days before the noisy energy of a young life. He'd always seemed invincible. He was last seen on a mountain slope in Europe. Then he was gone into a void that might have been man-made.
We always felt the answers were there, you know, and that somebody knew.
Trouble is, every now and then someone disappears. What happened to him? Well, everybody knows what happened to him.
Tonight, a cold case. The story of the Iceman. It is a challenge old as the human hunger for adventure. A glacier. The promise of unhindered speed. It is what drew a young Canadian to an Austrian mountain in the summer of 1989. Duncan MacPherson from Saskatoon. That impulse to challenge a distant mountain would plunge a family into a 20-year search for the truth of what happened the day Duncan MacPherson, 23 years old, vanished without a trace. It would take 14 years for a partial truth to emerge, which is when the Fifth Estate first became involved in the mystery, and a story first told by Hannah Gartner. Tonight we pick up where we left off 5 years ago, and we will take you as close to the truth of what really happened to young Duncan MacPherson as anyone will likely ever get. He grew up in Saskatoon, where from childhood, life seemed to focus on a rink. His friend and former hockey player, George Pessout.
When you grow up in the prairies, you know, there's not much else to do, so play hockey.
He was one of two kids, raised wholesome and healthy, immersed in traditional values by his parents, Bob and Linda McPherson.
It's how I raised my kids. Truth is everything, you know. We can all understand, accept, and even forgive. But first of all, you have to have accountability, and that means telling the truth.
His story was quintessentially Canadian. His destiny becoming more apparent with every hockey season.
The New York Islanders drank Duncan MacPherson from Saskatoon.
In the NHL professional draft of 1984, he was a first-round pick by the New York Islanders. He was big and he was tough and he worked hard, but after 5 hard years it was clear he wasn't big and tough enough for the NHL. The enforcer role just never seemed to fit. In the spring of 1988, the Islanders cut him loose. He was philosophical.
I guess they kind of just had plans for me, and I never lived up to them right off the bat, and things kind of just turned the other way. I just want to try getting away from here and see if hockey can be fun again.
The game itself, he liked, but he didn't like the games that went on. And he told me, you know, when they talk about the team, they don't mean the players. Like, the team is really up there in the front office. So anyway, he was real happy to be moving on in life.
But life was still hockey, and in the spring of 1989, he took a coaching job with a team in Dundee, Scotland. But first, a bit of downtime, a side trip to Europe to look up some old hockey friends who, like him, had moved their hockey dreams across the pond. George Pessout was living in Nuremberg, Germany then, and he was happy to put Duncan up for a few days. Duncan told George he was keen to visit Austria.
I just told Duncan, well, I just take my car.
Which was how in early August 1989, he ended up in a place he'd never been before. Learning a brand new skill on a glacier in Austria's Stubai Valley. On the 9th of August, Duncan MacPherson took his first snowboard lesson from instructor Walter Hinterhosel.
He was a professional sportsman, and usually you think these guys are 2 or 3 steps with the nose higher than all the other people, but he wasn't like that.
The Stubai slope was known for its speed, but in the summer of '89, the glacier was dangerous for the uninitiated. Warm summer weather had opened deep crevasses, sometimes hidden from visitors by a thin mantle of snow. Duncan MacPherson was new to the snowboard, but he was experienced on skis, and as a professional hockey player had strength and balance.
Seeing him working on the snow showed he was a really Canadian hot dog. He was not scared from falling. He had no fear because of the speed.
He was there for the fun and, like any tourist, not particularly interested in the local sociology or the peculiarities of a tourist-based economy where pride and prosperity go hand in hand. People who live in a tourist mecca like the Stubai Valley place a high premium on local reputation. It's what keeps the tourists coming with their cash. And in 1989, the year that Duncan MacPherson visited, there were over 1 million of those tourists. And every tourist operator understands that nothing threatens business like bad news. The afternoon of August 9th that year was ripe for bad news, as this photograph, snapped by a visitor that day, reveals it was very foggy. And unbeknownst to Duncan MacPherson, there were crevasses that could swallow up an adult if he wasn't careful. After a lesson in the morning, Duncan practiced in the afternoon. By all subsequent accounts, he had the course pretty much to himself, and this is where the mystery begins. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, skiing finished, the slope was being groomed. When the last gondola returned to base, Duncan MacPherson should have been on it, but he wasn't. Why he wasn't on it would become a question that would go unanswered for 14 years. When we come back, the silence of the Stubai Valley.
Somebody knew. You just could not just vanish from the face of the earth. Somebody knew.
On the night of August 12th, 1989, Linda MacPherson woke up screaming.
I had a very deep, deep sense that there was something wrong with Duncan.
She hadn't heard from her son Duncan in a week. It had been 5 days since he'd borrowed his friend's car in Nuremberg, Germany. George Passout.
You know, I know he's a pretty responsible kid. You know, I know he'd get a hold of me. A couple days went by, and then I started to be a little concerned because it's just not like him. After a couple more days, I think about after the 5th day, that's when I knew that there's something wrong.
When the phone finally did ring in Saskatoon, it was Duncan's new employer. Where was Duncan?
I was like, well, I think he's, pretty sure he's in Scotland, in Dundee. No, he isn't, Mrs. MacPherson. That's why I'm phoning you. He never got there. Actually, I remember that my heart hit the floor.
I knew a fellow in the criminal police in Nuremberg that was a big hockey fan. I approached him, I knew him, and then he said, Duncan's young, he's got a car, he's got money, we don't believe anything's happened to him.
Linda MacPherson called the RCMP in Saskatoon. They told her to call back during regular weekday office hours.
I think that's probably when we got our first clue that if anyone was going to find Duncan, it would not be police in this country or any country. And shortly thereafter, we just decided we have to go over there and find him.
Austria was a whole other world for the MacPhersons, who had never been to Europe before. They knew nothing about the place. They couldn't speak German and had no clue where to start looking for their missing son. But Austria is small, about the size of New Brunswick. They could cover a lot of ground quickly, so they rented a car, plastered it with photos of Duncan, and started to search. As with the RCMP, the Austrian police were no help either.
They kept saying nothing bad happens in Austria. There's a very low crime rate in Austria, and nothing bad happens here.
Innsbruck police assured the MacPhersons they had checked every hotel and hostel. Duncan had never stayed in the area. Incredibly, when the parents checked for themselves, they soon found Duncan's signature on a hostel register in Innsbruck.
If we hadn't done them ourselves, nobody would have done it.
Then a break. The local television station agreed to broadcast Duncan's photograph.
And it was only within hours after it was on television, the police received a call that that car is sitting up at the lift station at the glacier in the valley there, 40 kilometers from Innsbruck. And that was reported to the police by the parking lot attendant.
The car had been sitting in this lot for 42 days. In it, most of Duncan's belongings. The management of the resort where Duncan's car was found were defensive from the start. And one assertion would compound the mystery for years. They insisted Duncan's rented snowboard had been returned, so he couldn't have had an accident on their ski slope. Wherever he was, it wasn't their concern. This was good enough for the police. If the board came back from the glacier, so did Duncan, period. Now that's when the police called off the search.
He didn't go anywhere without taking the car or without all his belongings, his passport. You don't go very far in Europe without your passport. So it seemed to us that, you know, he's right here.
Somebody knew. You just could not just vanish from the face of the earth, be seen at 2:30 in the afternoon, the place closes at 4, and there is just vanished. Somebody knew.
Somebody surely knew about the car, abandoned in a parking lot for 6 weeks. And somebody knew that he'd been in an Innsbruck hostel, and that the next day he took a ski lift to the mountaintop and never came back down. But nobody was talking. Missing tourists are bad news, bad for business. In 2006, when the Fifth Estate investigated Duncan's disappearance, Hannah Gartner questioned then Deputy Chief of Investigations, Christoph Hunterfund.
The MacPhersons don't buy that your investigation was as thorough as you say it was.
It's their opinion, it's their thinking. They ask us about every step we did, and they were very suspicious, you know. Are you doing the right thing? Is everything...
They didn't trust you?
I had the opinion that they didn't trust the Austrian police to deal with such a case.
For 14 years, the Austrian police would do very little to inspire the confidence or the trust of the MacPhersons. Bob and Linda would make 9 separate trips to Austria, spend 300 days trekking through the mountains and valleys, blowing their retirement savings on their own. No help from the cops, the ski resort, or anybody else.
It's your child. Like, I mean, you mortgage the house. I think any parent would do that, even if you don't have the means. And I can't say that, you know, we did many things in connection with our search for him that we probably shouldn't have and couldn't have afforded. But I mean, you make other sacrifices.
Then on July 18th, 2003, a breakthrough, compliments of Mother Nature. A heat wave caused unusual melting on the glacier and revealed a human body. It was Duncan. Finally located in a hole in the middle of the ski run. The snowboard everyone insisted had been returned was in there with him. For his parents, a moment of relief.
I was like, God, this is over, you know? Yeah, I was happy.
And it seemed that the long ordeal was really over. A pathologist in Innsbruck explained that extensive damage to the body was consistent with the grinding action of a moving glacier. Dr. Walter Rabel.
I saw such damages on glacier corpses. Yes.
When the MacPhersons arrived in Austria to view their son's remains, he was laid out on a table with only his head showing.
I asked for time alone with him, and so Bob and Dr. Rabel went out, and I actually wanted to hold Duncan's hand, and so I started to uncover him, and it was his right side, so I started to take the sheet down, and I just saw something, and to this day I can't really explain it to you, but I thought, oh, that's not right, or that made me uncomfortable. And then I thought, what am I doing? I'm not here to examine his body, or I'm here to say goodbye. So I'll spend a few quiet moments with him, and leave the examination of his body for the police and the forensic people to explain to you.
The policeman, Christoph Hunterfund, saw no reason to reopen the investigation. Factual inconsistencies by ski resort managers, like whether or not that snowboard had come back, really didn't matter.
An accident occurred. Duncan MacPherson fell into a crevasse, and he was recovered 14 years later. So things like that occur every year.
You work on the assumption that this was just an accident.
This is what life teaches us every day. This is what our experience teaches us every day.
There was no reason to believe that someone lied about the snowboard.
What could be his interest?
There could be third-party liability, but you presume that it was Duncan's fault and nobody else.
Yeah.
To close the file, the police presented this scenario. He probably fell off the tow lift, then wandered off the approved ski run into an area riddled with open crevasses, fell into one, and died there.
Absolutely not, because there's no tows over in that area. It's not a groomed area, and he wouldn't leave there. And he knew enough about glaciers that you just do not wander off on a glacier in midsummer. He would never do that, and it just didn't add up right from the beginning.
The MacPhersons would later learn that, in fact, Duncan hadn't strayed anywhere. His body was located in the middle of the approved ski slope. And they would also discover that this was not uncommon, that exactly 1 year before Duncan went missing, another snowboarder had similarly vanished to turn up later dead in a crevasse. And they would also learn that such accidents were routinely hushed up by the authorities.
All at once, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. It was like standing on a manhole cover that gives way. Everything got dark. The ice walls flew past me. It got quiet.
Oliver Tork from Cologne, Germany was lucky. When he fell into a crevasse on Stubai Glacier, he survived to talk about it.
Yes, I feared for my life. I feared for my life. Look at my arms. When I talk, I get goosebumps.
I see.
Tork survived only because he had a cell phone, and miraculously he got a signal that enabled him to call for help.
And I stood there with the alpine rescue workers at the top of the crevasse. One of them was there with his snow grooming machine. He was filling in the crevasse. The other two were standing next to me.
The advice he got would resonate for the MacPhersons and perhaps explain just how a common accident could turn into a mystery for years, perhaps forever.
They said, "You were lucky." And then they said, "We're not reporting this to the press. Do you understand?"
The Austrian authorities declined to perform an autopsy. The pathologist, Dr. Walter Rabel, who would have done it had he been asked, told the MacPhersons an autopsy would have been an indignity that would have told them nothing new. It was to them a rare note of sympathy.
We had so much trust in him, that I don't think we certainly would not have had in anybody else there.
The MacPhersons returned to Saskatoon with Duncan's ashes and that snowboard which they stored in their garage. But while they couldn't have known it at the time, the snowboard would one day find a voice that would reveal a chilling narrative. What happened on one foggy summer afternoon in 1989? When we come back, a disturbing truth emerges.
What on earth are they concealing? I mean, you know, looks like it was just a skiing accident. Like, what the hell happened to this guy?
The official version of what happened was unremarkable. On August 9th, 1989, while learning to snowboard on the Stubai Glacier, 23-year-old Duncan MacPherson somehow left the main ski slope, fell into a crevasse where he probably just went to sleep. 14 years would pass before anyone would know for sure that he was dead. Injuries to the body were, according to the pathologist Dr. Walter Rabel, supposedly caused by having been entombed in moving, grinding ice.
Yes, yes. During the movement in the ice, the glacier breaks the body.
For the Austrian police, the case was closed.
The body has been found, the missing person turned up, and his name was deleted from the system, of course, now. And for us, the case is solved.
But in Saskatoon, Duncan's hometown, the official story left too many unanswered questions. His parents wanted answers. For a lot of people, maybe this would have been the end of the story. He's found, he died in a crevasse, he didn't suffer, it was an accident, and there's nothing can be done. What kept this story going for you guys?
It's just the way we're wired. I mean, I was brought up to question everything. From the time I was 6 years old, you know, you don't have to accept things. You need to question things.
First, there was that snowboard rental. Why had they been told that he'd returned his rented snowboard to the rental shop when that clearly wasn't true? It was buried with him in the middle of the ski run. And what about that car? How could it have sat in a parking lot for 6 weeks without raising questions, even after Austrian police had queries from abroad? Over time, the Austrian pathologist, Dr. Walter Rabel, had become a sort of friend. He seemed to share the MacPhersons' frustrations.
There were mistakes, problems. I feel guilty for other people involved in this case because they didn't do their job like they should do it because there remain questions and then they could have been cleared.
There were still nagging questions when we first told this story in 2006. The indifference, if not incompetence, of the investigators after Duncan disappeared made it unlikely that they'd ever be answered. What really happened that day on the ski slope? His snowboard was badly mangled, perhaps by a machine. Who was driving the machine? How did he react? Why the silence?
What on earth are they concealing? I mean, you know, looks like it was just a skiing accident. Like, what the hell happened to this guy?
Then in 2009, Duncan's parents found a partner, a writer with an appetite for mystery and a deep understanding of the culture of the Stubai Valley. And he suspected, just as they did, that there was something fishy, maybe even criminal, about how Duncan died.
Somebody leaves his clothes behind, his shoes, his driver's license, doesn't return his gear. It is critical that we establish what happened to this guy. We can't just shut it up and go home for the night.
John Leake lives in Palo Alto, California, but he lived in Austria for years. He wrote a book there, Descent into Hades, about a serial killer. Someone thought that Duncan's story would appeal to him, a suspicious disappearance in a remote and clannish place. Eventually, he traveled to Saskatoon to hear the MacPhersons' version of events. He was skeptical at first.
Well, everybody told me I was crazy for doing it, except my mother, interestingly enough. She was like, well, that sounds great, you know? I mean, maybe you could help these people. So I don't know. Maybe it tickled my vanity a little bit to kind of put on my Sherlock Holmes cap and go try and figure out what happened. So if I understand correctly, you've got the rental shop for the the snowboard equipment, and the ski school office, and they're both in this gondola station.
Right. Yes.
Besides research and writing skills, John Leake brought some crucial assets to the project: fluency in German and a knowledge of the region, its politics and economics.
And to get down from this at the end of the day, you've either got to hike down a steep path or you've got to ride the gondola down.
But even he quickly found himself stymied by what seemed to be a regional consensus. Outsiders weren't to be trusted. What happens in the Stubai Valley stays in the Stubai Valley.
It's like Duncan MacPherson entered the Twilight Zone, where suddenly all normal procedures, rules, regulations, customs, habits are turned on their head, and no one is following basic procedure anymore.
The Stubai Valley Ski Resort was the engine of the valley economy. It provided jobs, supported spin-off ventures, generated taxes for the state. The man whose enterprise had built the place got Austria's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, for transforming the sleepy valley into a major tourist destination.
Trouble is, every now and then you've got some kind of safety stuff that goes on up there. Someone disappears, tourist doesn't come down off the mountain at the end of the day. Well, what happened to him? Well, everybody knows what happened to him.
John Leake started researching what has since become an online book by reviewing what the Fifth Estate was able to find out in 2006. He was especially intrigued by Hannah Gartner's interview with the pathologist, Walter Rabel.
During the movement in the ice, the glacier breaks the body. But the injuries itself I could not examine exactly. But we saw the clothed body, did not declothe or unclothe him.
You didn't?
No.
How then were you able to make a thorough examination?
We never did an autopsy. We just have to do the identification.
Well, I saw that and I thought, why not? What hindered you? Remember, he's the guy who went to medical school and has the training to see on a body whether there's possible indications of culpability. I mean, that's why we have these people. That's why we train them, because they are the guys that can spot something, and it may be damn subtle what they're spotting, that's indicating, uh-oh, the story that the cops have been told, I'm seeing something on this body that is not consistent with the story the cops are being told.
The Fifth Estate had consulted a forensic anthropologist, Miriam Nafti, who studied X-rays the MacPhersons had obtained from Dr. Rabel.
There's multiple trauma, and the joint surfaces, based on the radiographs and photographs that I saw, would indicate that there was a violent fall, yes, but also perhaps some contact with machinery.
In 2006, the Fifth Estate reported that Duncan's clothing and that snowboard showed evidence of violent contact with a large machine. Dr. Rabel had promised to provide a CT scan that would have been definitive. He never sent it. Instead, the MacPhersons received these X-rays, which only show a portion of the body. It was a start, but for definitive answers, Leake would have to ask his questions in a place far away from the closed and silent Stubai Valley.
This presentation struck me immediately as not consistent with someone who simply suffered blunt trauma and then died of exposure on a ski slope.
Dr. Sorab Gologli, an orthopedic surgeon with trauma training, examined the X-rays at his clinic near San Francisco with the author John Leake.
It's this image here of the right hand, what we presume to be the right hand and forearm. The skin envelope's been transected, so it looks like there's been a transverse cut through the forearm.
Duncan's left leg and forearm had been neatly amputated.
Some type of force has gotten a hold of the soft tissue that is attached to the bone, specifically the muscles and the ligaments and the tendons, and it's torn that away. All of these injuries are to parts of the body that stick out and that are easily pulled into pieces of machinery.
Slowly, a chilling scenario took shape. Duncan MacPherson had an accident, but the consequences were compounded fatally by human error and possibly conspiracy. When we come back,
he hears a grooming machine coming up the slope. He's thinking, ah, finally they're coming to get me.
It was summertime, August 1989, when Duncan MacPherson from Saskatoon decided, maybe on a whim, to spend a day learning to use a snowboard on the Stubai Glacier near Innsbruck, Austria. He was familiar with ski slopes, but it was a foggy day, August 9th, and the course was rough. Even after everyone had gone, Duncan stayed to practice on his rented snowboard. As the day wore down, people who maintained the ski slope would be busy with their 5-ton piston bullies, smoothing out the course, grinding stray lumps of snow and ice to powder. At some point on that afternoon, Duncan MacPherson vanished. It would be 2003, 14 years later, before his body would turn up. How he died would remain a mystery, to be painfully unraveled in the years to come.
There's talk of, you know, he fell into a waterfall or went for a hike or whatever, but no one breathes a word to the MacPhersons that, well, you know, shit happens on this glacier. In fact, exactly 1 year ago, another tourist fell into a crevasse.
The author, John Leake, would discover that Duncan wasn't the first, nor would he be the last, to vanish from the mountain. And John Leake would find out that one of the features of the commercial and social scene in the Stubai Valley is a code of silence when bad things happen there. When he set out to help find out how Duncan died, he quickly realized he'd get very little help in Austria.
I think that the most logical explanation for this is that it would have been a publicity nightmare for the Stubai Glacier ski resort.
John Leake and the Fifth Estate before him would grow increasingly convinced that Duncan MacPherson had somehow, while learning to snowboard that afternoon in 1989, been mangled by a machine. The most likely suspect, one of those lumbering snow groomers that prowl the ski slopes.
And were my confidence in what happened and our concept of what happened really just took a quantum leap forward was when I turned up this guy, Dick Penniman.
Dick Penniman lives in California, a long way from the Stubai Valley. But over many years, he's become an expert when it comes to accidents on ski slopes. John Leake asked him to help deconstruct the mystery of Duncan's death. He started with a detailed examination of the equipment Duncan used the day he died.
And I just called him up and I said, look, I've got a case of a young guy disappeared in Austria in '89, last seen skiing at a glacier ski resort. I don't want to give you any preconceived ideas. I just want to ask you to look at the equipment.
The equipment, in particular Duncan's rented snowboard, would speak volumes to the expert, Dick Penniman. The snowboard had been torn apart by a machine.
There was no doubt in my mind when I saw this. Within minutes, it's clear that it was it went through a tiller. It went through at an angle, and those angles are consistent. The gouges are consistent with the tines on the tiller. Those same gouges are on the liner. This thing was shredded by a machine, no doubt about it.
The tiller is at the back end of the machine, grabs chunks of snow and ice, pulls them into the machine to break them up. The damage to the snowboard was consistent with injuries to Duncan's severed left leg.
It looked like his leg had gone through a meat grinder. It had been mangled. And that is not consistent, in my experience, with an injury caused by a fall or by a collision with another skier.
But Penniman's conclusion led to other questions about how it might have happened. Duncan's injuries were deadly, but seemed limited to his left arm and leg. Penniman soon figured out what might have happened.
What I actually did was to put a little model together. We have a top-down vision of the snowcat, and the attachment on the right is the grooming tiller. As the machine goes by, it can pass right by the person sitting on the snow, and the tracks never touch him. But if the machine at that very moment decides to turn left, then the tiller will actually swing out and away from the machine in this frame, and you can see how you can get caught between the tracks and the tiller, and the board goes in first, gets shot out and forward after it's gone through, and then the next thing to go in would be his leg, and then that pulls him into the machine. It's quite easy to explain how it could rip his leg apart, rip his board apart, and not show any signs of being run over by a tractor.
Even after 14 years in the glacier, the injuries were obvious. What was less clear was how his body, with severed limbs and mangled equipment, ended up in what amounted to a grave on the ski slope. John Leake would spend months with the grisly post-mortem photographs and x-rays, puzzling over what was, to him, a profoundly disturbing question. Disturbing because of the almost irresistible answer. Someone put him there.
You've got clothing, bone, blood, wrecked on the surface. But then his body melts out of the remnant of a shallow crevasse 14 years later. How did this wreck on the surface of the slope wind up in a neat package in a shallow crevasse? Those two actions do not go together. And I've talked to 20 different people who know glaciers and crevasses and physics and everything else, and no one can explain to me how those two things can happen without an intermediate action of someone, well, yeah.
The answer I came to in sort of an epiphany when I was walking around in my garden just trying to figure it out was, well, maybe he couldn't move out of the way.
Penniman's theory is consistent with the analysis of forensic experts. Duncan, the novice snowboarder, probably took a bad spill about mid-afternoon when he was alone on the slope. He broke his femur, the large bone above the knee.
And he's going through shock, undoubtedly. He's going through hypothermia, more than likely, and potentially blood loss if the break is severe enough. Any one of those three, or in combination, could make him lose consciousness or make him at least very slow to respond. And if he was conscious and he hears a grooming machine coming up the slope, he's thinking, ah, finally they're coming to get me.
But it was foggy, near whiteout. The driver of the machine doesn't see the injured snowboarder, passes close to him, snags the snowboard, along with parts of Duncan's body.
That scenario lends itself to a knee-jerk reaction, some kind of a panic response, and wanting to cover up the situation for a number of potential reasons. And we don't know what those reasons might be, but there's any number of really good ones that would cause somebody to think, I don't want to be caught with this on my hands.
Penniman says he's sure enough of his analysis that he'd have testified in court if there had been any legal follow-up. After 14 years, the possibility of charges like criminal negligence, even if there was an inclination to pursue them, had evaporated. The MacPhersons would draw little comfort from a civil lawsuit. But for them, the story isn't over, and maybe never will be. They continue to appeal to the management of the Austrian resort, the pathologist, Dr. Rabel, who probably knows more than he's ever told them, Canadian diplomatic sources, a pursuit that will, if nothing else, keep Duncan's memory alive.
Linda has been unable to get out of it. Her mind has gotten into this groove. Bob has gone into the vortex with her, and year after year after year, they have not been able to cast off this burden of wanting to know. There must be some kind of deep, primordial thing in the souls of some people. They can't rest until they know what happened to their dead child or their dead spouse.
Somebody somewhere on a slope did something awful. One day in August of 1989. That person has had a lot of bad days and nights, I suspect. What would you say if that person suddenly stepped up and said, I can't live with this anymore, I want to say I'm sorry? What would you say back?
I used to think about that because I used to actually imagine that happening. But I don't know if I'm too jaded now. I don't see it happening because it's not only if that person stepped out and admitted it, then what happens to all the other people that lied?
After more than 20 years, they have the answers they were looking for. What happened to their son? How it happened? But raw information in the absence of accountability offers little comfort. So they wait for someone, somewhere, to step forward, to take responsibility. Maybe they're setting aside legal ramifications. Maybe they're afraid of what you would say. What would you say if they did?
I don't think I'd be able to speak right now. I think I'd just be so happy I'd cry. Yeah, because for one thing, it would restore my faith in humanity.
The MacPhersons have asked the Austrian authorities to address the findings of the experts we consulted for our story. In his response, the pathologist Dr. Walter Rabel continues to insist that the damage to Duncan's body was caused not by a machine, but by the glacier in which he was entombed for 14 years. And that's our program for this week. For everyone here at the Fifth Estate, I'm Lyndon McIntyre. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.